What happens when the sanctity of a courtroom is shattered, not by a gavel, but by the sound of a pregnant woman's body hitting the floor for Eleanor Vance. Her divorce hearing was already a nightmare. Her husband, the man she'd built a life with, sat across the room with his beautiful, smug mistress, trying to leave her with nothing. But as the lies mounted and the stress became unbearable, she collapsed. And that's when the Mistress Isabella laughed. It was a sound of pure victory. But she and everyone else in that room had no idea that the real trial was just about to begin, hinging on a secret DNA test the judge was about to read aloud. A test that had nothing to do with the baby. The air in courtroom 4B of the San Francisco Superior Court was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sound. It was a sterile, suffocating quiet, broken only by the rustle of paper and the distant, muted wail of a city siren. For Eleanor Vance, each breath was a conscious effort, a shallow intake of the chilled, recycled air that did nothing to calm the frantic hummingbird wings of her heart. At 34, Eleanor should have been in the final blissful stages of nesting. She should have been painting a nursery, debating the merits of different strollers and feeling the gentle rhythmic kicks of her unborn son against her ribs as a promise of the future. Instead, she sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands resting protectively over the pronounced curve of her 8-month pregnancy, feeling those same kicks as a countdown to a battle she never wanted to fight. Across the room, bathed in the pale morning light, filtering through the tall, impersonal windows, sat the reason for her torment, Richard Vance, her husband, or what was left of him. He was the picture of success, dressed in a bespoke Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than her first car. His dark hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw set with a look of bored impatience. He hadn't looked at her once, not a single glance. His attention was entirely consumed by the woman beside him, Isabella Rossi. Isabella was everything Eleanor was not, especially now. She was a vision of sculpted perfection, her fiery red dress a slash of defiance in the drab courtroom. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her lips plump, and painted a matching shade of crimson, were permanently curved into a faint, knowing smirk. She leaned in close to Richard, whispering in his ear, her manicured hand resting possessively on his thigh. They were a portrait of triumph, a living, breathing testament to Eleanor's failure. Eleanor's own reflection in the polished wood of the witness stand showed a woman she barely recognized. Her normally bright hazel eyes were shadowed with sleepless nights. Her pale skin was stretched taut over her cheekbones. She wore a simple navy blue maternity dress, the most professional and unassuming thing she could find. She wanted to look respectable, composed. Instead, she felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. Her lawyer, Sarah Chen, a sharp, empathetic woman in her 40s, gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Deep breaths, Eleanor. We have a solid case. The law is on our side when it comes to marital assets." Eleanor nodded, but the words offered little comfort. This wasn't about assets. Not really. It was about erasure. Richard wasn't just divorcing her, he was trying to delete her from his history. His petition was a work of fiction, a cruel narrative that painted her as an opportunistic freeloader. He claimed that their 5-year marriage had been a mistake from the start, and that her contributions to his skyrocketing success were negligible. Negligible. The word echoed in her mind. Had it been negligible when she'd quit her promising career as an architectural historian to manage their home, his punishing social schedule, and the endless renovations on their Pacific Heights mansion? Was it negligible when she'd edited his business proposals late into the night, using her keen eye for detail to catch errors his own team had missed? Was it negligible when she'd supported him through his father's illness, holding him together, when his world threatened to crumble, and the baby, their son. Richard's petition coldly suggested a swift paternity test upon the child's birth, as if to cast doubt on the one pure thing they had created together. It was a lie, a strategic cruelty designed to wound her, and it worked. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise! The Honorable Judge Miller presiding." A woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun entered and took her seat. Judge Miller had a reputation for being tough fare and having an almost supernatural ability to see through deceit. Eleanor clung to that reputation like a life raft. "Please be seated," the judge said, her voice crisp. "We are here today to hear the petition for the dissolution of the marriage between Richard Vance and Eleanor Vance. Mr. Thorne, you may begin." Richard's lawyer, Marcus Thorne, rose. He was a perfect match for his client, slick, expensive, and radiating an aura of predatory confidence. "Thank you, Your Honor." Thorne began, his voice smooth as silk. "We are here today to expedite a simple, unfortunate matter. My client, Mr. Vance, wishes to dissolve this union and move forward. He has made a settlement offer that is by any standard exceedingly generous, considering Mrs. Vance brought little to the marriage and has made no significant contributions to the marital estate." Sarah Chen was on her feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. That is a gross mischaracterization." "Sustained," Judge Miller said, her eyes fixed on Thorne. "Stick to the facts, Mr. Thorne, not your client's preferred narrative." Thorne gave a slight, unbothered bow of his head. "Of course, Your Honor. The facts are these Vance Capital, my client's firm, has seen exponential growth over the past 5 years. This growth is a direct result of Mr. Vance's singular genius and tireless work ethic. Mrs. Vance, meanwhile, ceased all outside employment shortly after the wedding." He gestured dismissively towards Eleanor. "She enjoyed the fruits of my client's labor, a beautiful home, luxurious vacations, a life of leisure. While my client built an empire, Mrs. Vance decorated." Across the room, Isabella let out a soft, almost inaudible titter of laughter. It was a small sound, but in the tense silence of the courtroom it felt like a physical blow. Eleanor's cheeks flushed with heat. She felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, the judge, the court reporter, the spectators. She was being painted as a cliché, a kept woman, a gold digger. She gripped the edge of the bench, her knuckles turning white. She had to stay calm. For the baby. She took a deep breath, trying to focus on the rhythmic pulse in her ears, a frantic beat against the cold, condescending drone of Marcus Thorne's voice as he began to dismantle her life piece by painful piece. The storm had arrived. Marcus Thorne paced before the judge's bench like a panther circling its prey. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, brandishing them as if they were a weapon. "Let's talk about the marital estate, Your Honor." Thorne continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "The primary asset is, of course, Vance Capital. I have here financial records independently audited, proving that 100% of the firm's growth can be attributed to market strategies and client acquisitions developed and executed solely by my client, Mr. Richard Vance. There is not a single document, not an email, not a memo bearing Mrs. Vance's name or contribution." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the accusation hang in the air. Richard sat back, crossing his legs, a picture of calm authority. He was enjoying this. This was his arena, a world of hostile takeovers and aggressive negotiations. To him, this was just another deal to be closed, another asset to be stripped. Sarah Chen stood again. "Your Honor, Mr. Thorne is conveniently ignoring the concept of non-monetary contributions. My client managed every aspect of the Vance household and their complex social calendar, which was integral to Mr. Vance's business networking. She was an essential partner in building the platform from which he launched his success. Thorne scoffed a theatrical, disbelieving sound. A partner, Your Honor, planning dinner parties is not the same as navigating the complexities of international finance. Let's be serious. The generous settlement Mr. Vance has offered more than compensates Mrs. Vance for her time. He turned his gaze on Eleanor, his eyes cold and clinical. In fact, one could argue that Mrs. Vance has already profited handsomely from this marriage. I have credit card statements here detailing tens of thousands of dollars spent per month on, well, let's see, designer clothing spa treatments, high-end furnishings, lunches at exclusive clubs. He was twisting everything. The clothes were for the charity galas and business functions she was required to attend. The furnishings were for the house Richard insisted had to be a showpiece for his clients. The lunches were with the wives of his business partners, fostering relationships that had directly led to multi-million-dollar deals for Vance Capital. But Thorne presented it all as the frivolous spending of a bored, pampered wife. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. She wanted to scream, to stand up, and tell them all the truth. She wanted to detail the nights she'd spent awake, worrying with Richard over a volatile market, the ideas she'd given him that he'd later presented as his own, the sacrifices she had made without a second thought because she believed they were a team. But she had to remain silent, letting her lawyer speak for her while her character was systematically assassinated. Thorne wasn't finished. He moved on to the most painful subject, their attempts to start a family. For years, Thorne said, his voice softening into a mask of false sympathy, my client and Mrs. Vance tried to conceive a child. It was a difficult emotional journey, as I understand it. There were expensive fertility treatments, all paid for by Mr. Vance, of course, all of which were unfortunately unsuccessful. Eleanor flinched. He was making her infertility a public spectacle, another mark against her in the ledger of their marriage. She could feel Isabella's smug gaze on her, the younger woman, a symbol of effortless fertility and vitality. Then, Thorne continued, his voice hardening again, just as my client realized this marriage was irretrievably broken and informed Mrs. Vance of his intention to file for divorce, she suddenly miraculously became pregnant. The implication was disgusting, a vile insinuation that she had somehow trapped him. It was a lie. A vicious, calculated lie. They had been sleeping in separate rooms for months, but one desperate, lonely night, full of false promises and whispered apologies from Richard, had led to this baby. He had come to her seeking comfort after a fight with Isabella, and she, foolishly clinging to a shred of hope, had let him in. Objection! Sarah's voice was sharp as cracking ice. Counsel is implying a baseless and despicable accusation. The timing of the pregnancy is irrelevant to the division of assets acquired during the marriage. I am simply establishing a pattern of behavior, Your Honor, Thorne countered smoothly. A pattern of opportunism. Move on, Mr. Thorne. Judge Miller warned, her expression unreadable, but her tone firm. You're walking a very thin line. Thorne gave another slight bow, but the damage was done. He had planted the seed of doubt. He had painted Eleanor as manipulative, lazy, and deceitful. He then presented Richard's settlement offer a one-time payment of $500,000 and the car she drove. In exchange, she would vacate their multi-million-dollar home within 30 days and waive all future claims to any assets from Vance Capital now or in the future. It was a pittance. It was an insult. It was designed to leave her financially crippled right before she was due to give birth. My client believes this is more than fair, Thorne concluded, stepping back to his table. It allows Mrs. Vance to begin her new life comfortably while allowing my client to retain the business he and he alone built from the ground up." As he sat down, Isabella leaned over and kissed Richard on the cheek, a gesture of ownership and victory. She glanced at Eleanor, and for a fleeting moment their eyes met. Isabella's expression was one of pure, unadulterated contempt, mixed with a chilling sort of pity. It was the look of a victor gazing upon the vanquished. Eleanor's vision started to blur at the edges. A sharp, piercing pain shot through her lower back. The room felt suddenly hot, the air too thin to breathe. She placed a hand on her belly, trying to ground herself, trying to draw strength from the tiny life within her. But the pressure was becoming immense. The weight of the lies, the humiliation, the utter betrayal. It was a physical force pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. The muffled sound of Sarah Chen beginning her counter-argument seemed to come from a great distance. The faces in the courtroom began to warp and swim before her eyes. The hummingbird in her chest was now a frantic battering ram against her ribs. She was losing control. The world began to tilt. Eleanor gripped the smooth, worn wood of the bench, her knuckles white, her nails digging into the varnish. The sharp pain in her back was now a searing band that wrapped around her abdomen, tightening like a vice. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead, trickling down her temples. "Mrs. Vance, are you all right?" Sarah Chen's voice cut through the fog, laced with sudden concern. She had stopped her opening statement mid-sentence. Eleanor tried to answer, to nod, to make any gesture that would convey she just needed a moment. But her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. The words wouldn't form. She opened her lips, but only a small, strangled gasp escaped. The courtroom's ambient noise faded into a low, droning hum. Marcus Thorne's face, mid-objection, seemed to freeze in place. Richard, for the first time that day, turned his full attention to her, his expression not of concern, but of annoyance, as if her distress were a deliberate and inconvenient interruption. It was Isabella's face, however, that burned itself into Eleanor's memory. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of wide-eyed, fascinated disbelief. She wasn't seeing a woman in pain. She was seeing a piece of theater. "Your Honor, my client requires a moment." Sarah set her hand now on Eleanor's shoulder. The touch felt a million miles away. "Black spots," Eleanor managed to whisper the words, barely audible. The periphery of her vision was darkening, closing in like a tunnel. The baby gave a sudden violent kick, a movement born of distress, not gentle promise. The pain intensified tenfold, a white-hot agony that stole her breath completely. She knew this was bad. This wasn't just stress. This was a physical siren, a desperate alarm from her own body. The baby. Oh God, the baby. She tried to stand, driven by a primal instinct to flee, to get somewhere safe. But her legs were made of water. They buckled beneath her. With a soft cry, she pitched forward. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the shocked face of the court reporter. She saw the bailiff lurching to his feet. She saw Sarah lunging to catch her. And she saw Isabella Rossi, her crimson-painted lips parting not in a gasp of horror, but in a smile. And then she laughed. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh. It was a short, sharp, ugly burst of sound, a huff of derision and amusement. It was the laugh of someone who believed they were watching their rival's final pathetic act of desperation, a cheap theatrical ploy for sympathy. That sound was the last thing Eleanor heard before the world went completely black. Chaos erupted in courtroom 4B. "Medic bailiff, call for a medic!" Judge Miller's voice was a commanding crack of thunder cutting through the stunned silence. Sarah Chen managed to break Eleanor's fall, guiding her to the floor with a desperate cry of her name. She was immediately at her side, checking her pulse, loosening the collar of her dress. "Eleanor! Eleanor, can you hear me?" Richard remained frozen in his chair for a full 3 seconds, his face a mask of cold calculation. He was processing the situation not as a husband, but as a strategist. How does this affect the proceedings? How does this make me look? Marcus Thorne was already on his feet, his expression one of pure fury at the disruption. "Your Honor, this is an obvious delay tactic. Sit down and be silent, Mr. Thorne, or I will have you removed for contempt." The judge snapped her gaze like ice. "Your client's pregnant wife is unconscious on the floor of my courtroom. Show a shred of human decency." Isabella's laugh had died on her lips as soon as the judge's voice boomed. She now wore a mask of performative concern, placing a hand over her mouth. But her eyes, her dark, triumphant eyes, still glittered with a cold fire. She had seen weakness, and she had reveled in it. The bailiff was on his radio, his voice urgent and low. Paramedics were on their way. Within minutes that felt like hours, 2 uniformed EMTs burst through the courtroom doors with a gurney and medical bags. They moved with practiced efficiency surrounding Eleanor's still form. "What's her name? How far along is she?" one of them asked, attaching a blood pressure cuff. "Eleanor Vance, 34 weeks. Sarah supplied her voice, trembling slightly. "BP is 180 over 110. It's dangerously high. Possible preeclampsia. We need to move, now." They carefully lifted Eleanor onto the gurney, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor filling the room. As they wheeled her out, her face deathly pale against the stark white of the sheets, a small, damning piece of evidence fluttered from Sarah Chen's file, which had scattered when she rushed to help. It was a photograph. A simple, happy picture from a few years ago. Eleanor and Richard smiling on a sailboat, the picture of a happy couple. It landed face up on the floor, a relic from a forgotten civilization before being trampled under the heel of a rushing paramedic. Richard finally stood up, smoothing down his suit jacket. He made a move to follow a belated performance of concern for the benefit of the judge. "Mr. Vance, you will remain here," Judge Miller commanded. "But my wife," he began. "Your wife is in the care of professionals." The judge cut him off, her eyes boring into him. "This court is in recess for 1 hour. When we reconvene, I expect a full explanation for the deplorable behavior I have witnessed here today, and that includes the conduct of your associate." She gave Isabella a look of such profound disdain that even the immaculately confident woman flinched. The courtroom doors swung shut, leaving Richard and Isabella standing in a silence that was no longer just quiet, but thick with judgment. The game had just changed, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed Richard's handsome face. His perfectly controlled narrative had just been derailed by the one thing he could never predict, the raw, undeniable reality of human fragility. Eleanor awoke to the steady, rhythmic beep of a machine and the sterile scent of antiseptic. For a moment she was disoriented, the white ceiling above her unfamiliar. Then the memory of the courtroom, of Thorne's voice, of the searing pain, and of Isabella's cruel laugh came rushing back. A sob caught in her throat. "Easy, easy. You're safe." Sarah Chen's calm voice cut through her panic. Her lawyer was sitting in a chair beside the bed in a small private room adjacent to the court's infirmary. A doctor had already seen her, stabilized her blood pressure, and confirmed that both she and the baby were, for the moment, out of immediate danger. The diagnosis was a severe stress-induced hypertensive crisis, a precursor to preeclampsia. The collapse was very, very real. The baby. Eleanor whispered, her hand flying to her belly. His heartbeat is strong. Sarah reassured her, her expression softening. He's a fighter, just like his mom. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, tears of relief, fear, and a deep, simmering anger. She laughed, Sarah. I was on the floor and she laughed. I know, Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Everyone heard it. The judge heard it. It was a mistake she will live to regret. Eleanor closed her eyes, taking a few deep breaths, trying to push away the image of Isabella's smug face. She needed to focus. The weakness she felt was a luxury she couldn't afford. The recess? Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. How long do we have? The judge gave us an hour, but I can request a postponement. The doctor insists you go to the hospital for observation. No, Eleanor said, her voice firm. She began to push herself up, wincing as her muscles protested. No postponement. We're finishing this today, now. Sarah looked at her, a mixture of concern and admiration in her eyes. Eleanor, are you sure no one would blame you for stopping? Stopping is what he wants, Eleanor said, her gaze hardening. He wants me to be the weak, hysterical, pregnant woman who runs away. He wants to paint me as fragile and unstable. I am not going to give him that. We knew this would be ugly. We just didn't know how ugly. She was right. They had prepared for this. For weeks they had been strategizing, anticipating every move Richard and his legal shark would make. They knew Richard's arrogance was his greatest weakness. They had counted on him overplaying his hand. They had built a trap, and Richard, with his theatrics and cruelty, was walking right into it. Did you bring the file? Eleanor asked. Sarah nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a slim, deceptively simple manila folder. It contained no complex financial charts or legal precedents. It contained a single 2-page report from a DNA diagnostics lab in San Mateo. He thinks he has me cornered, Eleanor said, looking at the folder. He thinks the only card I have to play is this baby. He's so arrogant, so sure of himself, that he can't imagine a world where I have my own secrets. The plan had been born from a moment of accidental discovery 6 months ago, long before Richard had even mentioned divorce. She had been searching for a sentimental photograph in the back of his home office closet, a space he rarely used. Tucked away in an old shoebox filled with his late father's memorabilia, she found a yellowed, sealed envelope. It was addressed to Richard's mother, Martha Vance, in a script she didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside was a letter dated a year after Richard was born. It was a love letter full of passion and regret from a man named Daniel. He wrote of their time together, of his sorrow that she chose to stay with her powerful husband, Charles Vance Sr. And he ended with a heart-wrenching plea. I know you will raise our son to be a great man. Please just send me a picture of him on his birthday each year. It's all I ask. Our son. The world had tilted on its axis that day. Richard, the proud heir to the Vance dynasty, the man who spoke endlessly of his father's legacy, was not a Vance by blood. It explained so much: his deep-seated insecurity, his desperate, almost pathological need to prove himself, the strange, cold distance Charles Vance Sr. had always maintained with his only son. Eleanor had realized that Richard probably didn't even know. His mother, Martha, a formidable and proud woman, would have taken that secret to her grave. Eleanor had sealed the letter and put it back, her mind reeling. She never intended to use it. It felt like a violation, a secret that wasn't hers to tell. But then Richard had served her with divorce papers. He had brought Isabella into their home. He had threatened to leave her and their child with nothing. He had decided to play dirty. So she had decided to fight back with the truth. How did we get the sample? Eleanor asked, needing to go over it one last time. Exactly as we planned, Sarah said. 2 months ago you told him you wanted one last civil cup of coffee to discuss things. He met you at that little cafe on Fillmore Street. He was so smug, so confident, he was just there to dictate terms he didn't think twice. He drank his espresso, left the cup on the table. The private investigator we hired was sitting 2 tables away. He collected the cup as soon as you left. We sent it to the lab along with the saliva sample from the licked envelope of the old letter. The lab confirmed a paternal match between the DNA on the envelope and the DNA on the cup. Daniel, whoever he was Richard's biological father. Eleanor nodded. It was a long shot, a wild, desperate move. But it was all she had. This wasn't about paternity of her baby. It was about his. His entire claim, his whole identity is built on being Charles Vance Sr.'s son, Eleanor said softly. The company bylaws, the trust funds, the inheritance. It's all predicated on direct lineage. Richard knows his father was a stickler for bloodlines. If this comes out, he loses everything, Sarah finished for her. He's not the heir to the Vance fortune. He's the heir to nothing. Vance Capital was funded with seed money from a trust that, according to the terms I looked up, is strictly for lineal descendants of Charles Vance Sr. He's been living a lie, and more importantly, he has built his empire on a fraudulent claim. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath. This was it. She wasn't the victim anymore. She wasn't the gold digger or the desperate, hysterical wife. She was the one holding the bomb. Okay, she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Help me up. It's time to go back to court. Sarah watched her no longer with concern, but with awe. The woman who had been carried out on a gurney was gone. In her place was a warrior calm and resolute, ready to burn down an empire to protect her child and reclaim her life. When the doors to courtroom 4B swung open, exactly 1 hour after the recess was called, the atmosphere inside was a thick soup of tension and anticipation. Judge Miller was already on the bench, her face a stony mask. Richard Vance and Marcus Thorne sat at their table whispering furiously, their earlier confidence visibly shaken. Isabella Rossi was there too, but she was no longer sitting proudly beside Richard. The judge had directed her to the public gallery, a clear and public demotion. She sat with her arms crossed, her beautiful face pinched with resentment. Every head in the room swiveled towards the doors as Eleanor entered. If they were expecting to see a frail, defeated woman, they were sorely mistaken. Eleanor walked in under her own power, her posture erect, her head held high. Sarah Chen was at her side, not supporting her, but walking with her as an equal. Eleanor's face was still pale, but her eyes, which had been clouded with pain and fear before, were now clear and sharp as diamonds. There was a dangerous calm about her, a stillness that was far more intimidating than any outburst would have been. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard stared, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at her as if seeing a stranger. This was not the pliable, emotional woman he had decided to discard. This was someone else entirely. Eleanor met his gaze for a fraction of a second, her expression unreadable, and then dismissed him, turning her full attention to the judge. She and Sarah took their seats. Mrs. Vance, Judge Miller said, her voice softer than before, yet still formal. The court has been informed by the attending physician that you are here against medical advice. Are you certain you are well enough to proceed? I am, Your Honor. Eleanor replied, her voice steady and clear, resonating with a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. There is a matter of great urgency that I believe needs to be brought to the court's attention today. Judge Miller studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Mr. Thorne, your client and his companion's behavior was appalling. I am noting it for the record. Ms. Chen, you had the floor. Thank you, Your Honor, Sarah said, rising to her feet. The energy had shifted. Sarah was no longer on the defensive. She was on the hunt. Before the interruption, Sarah began, Mr. Thorne was making a case that my client, Mrs. Vance, made no significant contributions to the marital estate. He painted a picture of a woman of leisure, spending her husband's money. We are here to dismantle that fiction piece by piece. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah Chen methodically and brilliantly eviscerated Marcus Thorne's entire argument. She presented evidence Eleanor had painstakingly compiled. Emails showing Eleanor's detailed feedback on business plans, guest lists and seating charts from dozens of social events with handwritten notes cross-referencing guests' business interests, which had directly led to new clients for Vance Capital. She even had sworn affidavits from 2 former household employees attesting to the fact that Eleanor managed the home's finances and renovation projects with the precision of a CEO. Mr. Thorne would have you believe my client decorated, Sarah said, her voice ringing with indignation. My client managed a multi-million-dollar asset, their home, and served as an unpaid yet essential social and business strategist for her husband. His success was not his alone. It was a joint venture. Richard was starting to look uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. This was not going according to plan. Thorne interjected with objections, but Judge Miller overruled them one by one. The narrative was slipping from their control. Then Sarah moved to the next phase of her attack. Mr. Thorne also made a particularly vile insinuation about the timing of my client's pregnancy, she said, her eyes flashing. He suggested it was a tool for leverage in these proceedings. It is a testament to Mr. Vance's character that he would allow such a disgusting accusation to be leveled against the mother of his child. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the silent room. But since Mr. Vance is so concerned with parentage and biology, Sarah continued, her voice dropping slightly, we decided to address the matter head-on. We took the liberty of commissioning a DNA test. At the mention of a DNA test, a wave of relief washed over Richard's face. He smirked, leaning over to whisper to Thorne. This was what they'd expected. Eleanor was going to try and prove the baby was his, a desperate emotional plea. It was a weak move. It changed nothing about the finances. Isabella from the gallery allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The fool was playing right into their hands. This would just confirm the baby was Richard's problem to deal with, but it wouldn't get her any closer to his money. We have the results here, Sarah said, walking towards the clerk. She held up the slim manila folder. I would like to submit this report as evidence and ask that Your Honor read the conclusion into the record. Thorne stood up. Your Honor, we'll stipulate that my client is the father of the unborn child. This is a waste of the court's time. It's irrelevant to the financial settlement. On the contrary, Sarah said, her voice turning to steel, it is more relevant than anything that has been discussed in this courtroom today. In fact, it changes everything. That Judge Miller looked from Sarah's intensely serious face to Thorne's dismissive one. Her curiosity was piqued. I'll allow it, she said. The clerk will mark it as Petitioner's Exhibit C. The clerk took the folder and handed it to Judge Miller. The room was utterly silent. Everyone leaned forward. Richard crossed his arms, a smug, expectant look on his face, ready for this final bit of melodrama to be over. Eleanor held her breath. Her heart was pounding, but this time it was not with fear. It was with the thunderous, terrifying thrill of a single match being struck in a room full of dynamite. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all they had to do was wait for the explosion. Judge Miller put on a pair of reading glasses that had been resting on her desk. She broke the seal on the manila folder with a crisp, tearing sound that echoed in the tomb-like silence of the courtroom. Her eyes, magnified by the lenses, scanned the first page of the report from Bay Area Genetic Diagnostics. Richard Vance watched her, a bored expression on his face. He nudged Marcus Thorne, whispering, "Get ready to object on grounds of relevance as soon as she's done. Let's wrap this circus up." Thorne nodded confidently. Isabella sat forward on her bench in the gallery, her painted lips curled in a slight sneer. She was picturing the headlines, the society gossip. The pregnant wife's last desperate gamble falling flat. It would only make her own position at Richard's side seem that much more secure. But Judge Miller didn't simply glance at the result and move on. She read the first page, and then with a slight frown she read it again. Her impassive judicial mask began to crack. A flicker of something confusion, then astonishment, crossed her features. She slowly turned to the second page, which contained the summary and conclusion. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The silence in the room stretched from seconds into a full minute. It became heavy, charged, with an unspoken question. Richard's smirk began to fade, replaced by a flicker of irritation. What was taking so long? It was a simple paternity test. A match or no match. "Your Honor," Marcus Thorne finally ventured, unable to stand the suspense. "Is there an issue with the document?" Judge Miller slowly lowered the report, placing it flat on her desk. She took off her glasses and looked not at the lawyers, but directly at Richard Vance. Her gaze was intense, analytical, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice devoid of its earlier clipped efficiency. It was now low and deliberate. "This document is indeed a DNA comparison report." Richard nodded, urging her on. "Yes, and as we've said, we stipulate, be quiet." The judge commanded, her voice soft, but carrying the unyielding force of a tectonic plate shifting. "You do not understand what this is." She picked the report back up. This test was commissioned to compare two DNA samples. Sample A was collected from a disposable coffee cup used by Mr. Richard Vance. Sample B was extracted from a dehydrated saliva sample found on the seal of a 30-year-old envelope. A knot of confusion tightened in Richard's stomach. A 30-year-old envelope. What did that have to do with anything? He shot a questioning look at Eleanor, but she was staring straight ahead, her face as serene and immovable as a statue. "The purpose of the test," Judge Miller continued, reading directly from the report's summary, "was to determine if the individual from whom Sample A was taken shares a paternal lineage with the individual who provided Sample B." Thorne was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." "This is absurd. What is the relevance of some mysterious 30-year-old letter? This is a theatrical stunt. Mrs. Vance is clearly unwell, and Mr. Thorne." The judge's voice was a whip crack. "If you interrupt me again, I will have the bailiff escort you to a holding cell to rest for the next 48 hours. Your client opened the door to the relevance of genetics. Now we are all going to walk through it. Sit down." Thorne, stunned into silence by the sheer force of her command, slowly sank back into his chair. Every eye was now glued on the judge. Judge Miller cleared her throat. "The conclusion of the report is as follows. The genetic markers present in Sample A, Richard Vance, and Sample B, unknown male from envelope, show a 99.999% probability of a direct father-son relationship. The individual who licked the envelope is the biological father of Richard Vance." A collective confused gasp went through the room. Richard stared, uncomprehending. Father-son. But the test was supposed to be about his baby with Eleanor. What was this? That's impossible, Richard said aloud, shaking his head. The lab made a mistake. My father is Charles Vance. That, Judge Miller said, her eyes boring into him, is where this report gets interesting. She held up the document. This report, Mr. Vance, was not submitted to prove the paternity of your unborn child. It was submitted, it seems, to disprove yours. The meaning of her words finally began to dawn on Richard, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. His face went slack, the color draining from it, until his skin was the color of ash. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Attached to this report, the judge continued, her voice resonating with the gravity of the moment, is a sworn affidavit from my client, Mrs. Eleanor Vance. Sarah Chen had risen to her feet. In it, she testifies that the envelope in question was a letter she discovered addressed to Mr. Vance's mother, Martha Vance. A letter from a man named Daniel Gallagher, postmarked 1991. A letter in which Mr. Gallagher refers to the infant Richard Vance as our son. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers. Isabella Rossi shot to her feet in the gallery, her face a mask of horrified confusion. What is she talking about? This is crazy. Richard, tell them it's a lie. But Richard couldn't speak. He was staring at Eleanor, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He was remembering things. Fragments. His mother's fierce, almost desperate protectiveness, the cold, appraising way his father, Charles Sr., had always looked at him, the cryptic, cutting remarks Charles would make after a few drinks about blood and legacy. It was all coalescing a lifetime of confusing moments, suddenly snapping into a terrifying, coherent picture. The relevance, Mr. Thorne, since you were so concerned with it, Sarah Chen said, her voice cutting through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. Is this Richard Vance has built his entire career, his entire identity on the premise that he is the sole heir to the Charles Vance Sr. estate and fortune. The seed money for Vance Capital came from a lineal descendant trust fund. He has secured loans, partnerships, and clients based on the implicit guarantee of the Vance family name and its associated wealth. A name and wealth to which it now appears he has no biological claim whatsoever. She let that sink in. Your Honor, we are not just here for a divorce. We are here because Mr. Vance has committed marital fraud on a colossal scale. He has misrepresented his assets because the assets he claims as his own are in fact built upon a foundation of deceit. They may not even legally belong to him. Therefore, any settlement offer he has made is void. The entire marital estate is now in question. The bomb had detonated, and the fallout was just beginning. Marcus Thorne sat frozen, his jaw hanging open, his entire case disintegrating before his eyes. Isabella stood trembling in the gallery, her mind frantically trying to process the information. The billionaire heir she had attached her future to was a fraud. And in the center of the devastation she had wrought, Eleanor Vance sat perfectly still, placing a calm, protective hand on her belly. She finally met Richard's panicked, pleading gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hatred, only a profound and sorrowful finality. The game was over. She had won. The ensuing moments were pure chaos. Richard Vance, his face a ghastly shade of white, finally found his voice. It was not the confident, booming baritone the court had heard earlier, but a raw, strangled cry of denial. "It's a lie, a trick. She forged it. That letter, it's a fake," he yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Eleanor. "She's a venomous snake trying to ruin me." Judge Miller slammed her gavel down the sharp crack, silencing the room. "Mr. Vance, one more outburst like that, and you will be held in contempt. You are in a court of law, not a schoolyard." But Marcus Thorne finally jolted out of his stupor, scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. We haven't seen this evidence. We demand a continuance to verify these outrageous claims." "A continuance will be granted, Mr. Thorne," Judge Miller said coolly. "But let me be clear. The lab that performed this test is one of the most reputable in the state. This report is notarized, and the chain of custody for the samples is meticulously documented. You are free to challenge it, but I suggest you advise your client of the legal ramifications of perjury and fraud should this report be proven accurate." The judge's words hung in the air, a clear warning. She believed the report. "And as for the matter at hand," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the wreckage of the proceedings, "Ms. Chen is correct. These allegations fundamentally alter the nature of this case. The entire basis of the marital estate is now in question. The petition for dissolution as it stands is hereby stayed. All assets held by Mr. Vance personally or through his businesses are frozen pending a full forensic accounting and an investigation into their provenance." Frozen. The word was a death knell. Richard sank back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Frozen. His accounts, his investments, his credit lines, everything. Vance Capital, his entire empire, was paralyzed. In the gallery, Isabella Rossi finally understood. The blood drained from her face, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a grotesque mask. The man she had bet her entire future on was not a Vance. He was a nobody. The life of luxury, the social status, the endless river of money she had so viciously fought for had just evaporated. She looked from Richard's crumbling form to Eleanor's serene one, and for the first time, the look in her eyes was not contempt, but pure, unadulterated terror. She had hitched her wagon to a falling star. Without a sound, she grabbed her designer handbag, turned, and practically fled the courtroom. Her war was lost, and she was abandoning the battlefield. Richard watched her go, a final, pathetic humiliation. The woman for whom he had destroyed his marriage was abandoning him at the first sign of real trouble. The judge's next words were directed at Sarah Chen. "Ms. Chen, I am ordering a new hearing in 30 days. In the meantime, I am issuing a temporary order granting your client exclusive use of the marital home, full coverage of all her medical and living expenses by Mr. Vance's personal accounts, what's left of them before the freeze takes full effect, and a restraining order requiring Mr. Vance to stay 500 feet away from Mrs. Vance." It was a total unconditional victory, more than Eleanor had even dared to hope for. "Furthermore," the judge added, her voice softening as she looked at Eleanor, "given the circumstances and the obvious stress these proceedings have caused, I am referring this case to the Family Services Division to ensure you and your child have all the support you need. The court takes a very dim view of litigants who use emotional cruelty and baseless accusations as a legal strategy, Mr. Thorne." She fixed him with a final withering glare. The proceedings were over. Judge Miller rose and exited the chamber. The courtroom buzzed with the aftermath. Reporters who had been covering the high-profile divorce were already on their phones frantically reporting the unbelievable twist. The story was no longer about a simple divorce. It was about the potential collapse of the Vance dynasty. Richard Vance remained at the table, a broken man. His lawyer was trying to talk to him, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at Eleanor as she and Sarah calmly gathered their things. His life had been a lie. His name, his legacy, his money, all of it was built on sand, and the tide had just come in. He had flown too close to the sun, blinded by his own arrogance, and in trying to burn his wife, he had incinerated himself. As Eleanor walked past him to leave the courtroom, he looked up, his eyes pleading. "Eleanor, why?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. Eleanor paused, looking down at the man who was now a stranger to her. There was no anger left, only a vast, empty sadness for what they had lost and what he had thrown away. "You tried to erase me, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You tried to pretend I was nothing, that I contributed nothing. You tried to cast doubt on our son. You just forgot that all those years I spent quietly in the background, I wasn't just decorating, I was listening, I was watching, and I was learning." With that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the ruins of her old life behind her. She stepped out into the bright California sun, taking a deep, clean breath for the first time in months. The future was uncertain, but it was hers. Hers and her son's. The fight was over, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was peaceful. It was the sound of freedom. And so Eleanor Vance walked away, not with a settlement, but with something far more valuable, the truth. Her story is a powerful reminder that integrity and inner strength are weapons that no amount of money or arrogance can defeat. In a world where people are often judged by their wealth and power, Eleanor proved that the most formidable power comes from knowing who you are and fighting for what is right, not just for yourself, but for those you love. She faced down betrayal and public humiliation, and through her quiet courage, she revealed that the grandest empires are often just houses of cards, waiting for a single breath of truth to bring them tumbling down. If you were on the edge of your seat watching Eleanor's incredible story of justice unfold, please let us know by hitting that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about the ultimate triumph of the underdog, don't hesitate to share this video. Most importantly, to make sure you don't miss our next real-life drama, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What did you think of the final twist? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for listening.